part two. I have pest control at my house today, and so they're checking on. We had termites years ago, and we had professionals come out and handle them. And we still have bait stations. Every 6 months they come and check the bait stations. So that's what they're doing today. I always come really early in the morning. Anyways, that's what they're doing today. But unfortunately, they're like, oh, we noticed that you have other, we have wasps. It's just that time of year. Do you want to pay for services? I'm like, no. But yeah, I mean, we paid for services for over a year, but it was $150 or something a month. And we still had bugs getting in the house and stuff, so I'm like, it ain't worth it. No one. She used to practice mounting, holding the reins, and sitting straight on an old saddle in a tree. Now she rides anything, for she doesn't know what fear is. And the stableman lets her have horses cheap because she trains them to carry ladies so well. She has such a passion for it, I often tell her if everything else fails, she can be a horsebreaker and get her living so. At this awful speech, Amy contained herself with difficulty, for the impression was being given that she was rather a fast young lady, which was her especial aversion. But what could she do? For the old lady was in the middle of her story, and long before it was done, Joe was off again, making more droll revelations and committing still more fearful blunders. And long before it was done, Joe was off again, making more droll revelations and committing still more fearful blunders. I think one of them's driving away. Yes, they come. They're these green things that are in the ground that have bait on them for termites. So they're like, oh, I see this one's been attacked. I'm like, well, we had foundation repairs, and they haven't been here since the foundation repairs, I don't think. Anyways, we had foundation repairs, so all of the dirt was upset, so any termites living around my house got disturbed. The quantity of bugs that have been in my house since that is insane. And long before it was done, Joe was off again, making more droll revelations and committing still more fearful blunders. Yes, Amy was in despair that day, for all the good beasts were gone, and of 3 left, one was lame, one blind, and the other so bulky that you had to put dirt in his mouth before he would start. Nice animal for a pleasure party, wasn't it? Which one did she choose? Asked one of the laughing gentlemen who enjoyed the subject. None of them. She heard of a young horse at the farmhouse over the river, and though a lady had never ridden him, she resolved to try because he was handsome and spirited. Her struggles were really pathetic. There was no one to bring the horse to the saddle, so she took the saddle to the horse. My dear creature, she actually rode it over the river, put it on her head, and marched up to the barn to the utter amazement of the old man. Did she ride the horse? Of course she did, and had a capital time. I expected to see her brought home in fragments, but she managed him perfectly, and was the life of the party. Well, I call that plucky. And young Mr. Lamb turned an approving glance upon Amy, wondering what his mother could be saying to make the girl look so red and uncomfortable. Hold on. I'm checking to see if they've sent me any texts or anything. Oh, I can see texts on my computer. She was still redder and more uncomfortable a moment after when a sudden turn in the conversation introduced the subject of dress. One of the young ladies asked Joe where she got the pretty drab hat she wore to the picnic. And stupid Joe, instead of mentioning the place where it was bought 2 years ago, must needs answer with unnecessary frankness. Oh, Amy painted it. You can't buy those soft shades, so we paint ours any color we like. It's a great comfort to have an artistic sister. Is that... Miss Lamb. "Isn't that an original idea?" cried Mrs. Lamb, who found Joe great fun. "That's nothing compared to some of her brilliant performances. There's nothing the child can't do." "Why, Miss Lamb would be young." "Isn't that an original idea?" cried Miss Lamb, who found Joe great fun. "Amy's gonna be mad." Great fun. "That's nothing compared to some of her brilliant performances. There's nothing the child can't do. Why, she wanted a pair of blue boots for Sally's party, so she just painted her soiled white ones the loveliest shade of sky blue you ever saw. And they looked exactly like satin," added Jo with an air of pride in her sister's accomplishments that exasperated Amy till she felt that it would be a relief to throw her card case at her. "We read a story of yours the other day and enjoyed it very much," observed the elder Miss Lamb. Observed the elder Miss Lamb. "We read a story of yours the other day and enjoyed it very much," observed the elder Miss Lamb, wishing to compliment the literary lady, who did not look the character just then, it must be confessed. Must be confessed. Any mention of her works always had a bad effect upon Jo, who either grew rigid and looked offended or changed the subject with a brusque remark, as now. "Sorry you could find nothing better to read. I write that rubbish because it sells and ordinary people like it. Are you going to New York this winter?" As Miss Lamb had enjoyed the story, this speech was not exactly grateful or complimentary. The minute it was made, Jo saw her mistake, but fearing to make the matter worse, suddenly remembered that it was for her to make the first move toward departure, and did so with an abruptness that left three people with half-finished sentences in their mouths. "Amy, we must go. Goodbye, dear. Do come and see us. We are pining for a visit. I don't dare to ask you, Mr. Lamb. But if you should come, I don't think I should have the heart to send you away." Jo said this with such a droll imitation of May Chester's gushing style that Amy got out of the room as rapidly as possible, feeling a strong desire to laugh and cry at the same time. "Didn't I do that well?" asked Jo with a satisfied air as they walked away. "Nothing could have been worse," was Amy's crushing reply. "What possessed you to tell those stories about my saddle, and the hats and boots and all the rest of it?" "Why, it's funny and amuses people. They know we are poor, so it's no use pretending that we have grooms. Buy 3 or 4 hats a season and have things as easy and fine as they do. You needn't go and tell them all our little shifts and expose our poverty in that perfectly unnecessary way. You haven't a bit of proper pride and never will learn when to hold your tongue and when to speak," said Amy despairingly. Poor Jo looked abashed, and silently chafed the end of her nose with a stiff handkerchief, as if performing a penance for her misdemeanors. "How shall I behave here?" she asked as they approached the third mansion. "Just as you please. I wash my hands of you," was Amy's short answer. "Then I'll enjoy myself. The boys are at home, and we'll have a comfortable time. Goodness knows I need a little change, for elegance has a bad effect upon my constitution," returned Jo gruffly, being disturbed by her failures to suit. An enthusiastic welcome from 3 big boys and several pretty children speedily soothed her ruffled feelings. An enthusiastic welcome from 3 boys and several pretty children speedily soothed her ruffled feelings, and leaving Amy to entertain the hostess and Mr. Tudor, who happened to be calling likewise, Jo devoted herself to the young folks and found the change refreshing. She listened to college stories with deep interest, caressed pointers and poodles without a murmur, agreed heartily that Tom Brown was a brick, regardless of the improper form of praise, and when one lad proposed a visit to his turtle tank, she went with an alacrity which caused Mamma to smile upon her as that motherly lady settled the cap, which was left in a ruinous condition by filial hugs, bear-like but affectionate, and dearer to her than the most faultless coiffure from the hands of an inspired Frenchwoman. Coiffure? Coiffure. And dearer to her than the most faultless coiffure of the damn it. And dearer to her than the most faultless coiffure from the hands of an inspired Frenchwoman. Leaving her sister to her own devices, Amy proceeded to enjoy herself to her heart's content. Mr. Tudor's uncle had married an English lady who was third cousin to a living lord, and Amy regarded the whole family with great respect. For in spite of her American birth and breeding, she possessed that reverence for titles which haunts the best of us, that unacknowledged loyalty to the early faith in kings which set the most democratic nation under the sun in a ferment at the coming of a royal yellow-haired laddie, some years ago, and which still has something to do with the love the young country bears the old, like that of a big son for an imperious little mother, who held him while she could and let him go with a farewell scolding when he rebelled. But even the satisfaction of talking with a distant connection of the British nobility did not render Amy forgetful of time, and when the proper number of minutes had passed, she reluctantly tore herself from this aristocratic society, and looked about for Jo, fervently hoping that her incorrigible sister would not be found in any position which should bring disgrace upon the name of March. It might have been worse, but Amy considered it bad, for Jo sat on the grass with an encampment of boys about her, and a dirty-footed dog reposing on the skirt of her state in festival dress, as she related one of Laurie's pranks to her admiring audience. Hold on. Okay. Audience. One small child was poking turtles with Amy's cherished parasol. A second was eating gingerbread over Jo's best bonnet, and a third playing ball with her gloves. But all were enjoying themselves. And when Jo collected her damaged property to go, her escort accompanied her, begging her to come again. It was such fun to hear about Laurie's... It was such fun to hear about Laurie's larks. Capital boys, aren't they? I feel quite young and brisk again after that, said Jo, strolling along with her hands behind her, partly from habit, partly to conceal the bespattered parasol. Why, do you always avoid Mr. Tudor? Asked Amy, wisely refraining from any comment upon Jo's dilapidated appearance. Don't like him. He puts on airs, snubs his sisters, worries his father, and doesn't speak respectfully of his mother. Laurie says he is fast, and I don't consider him a desirable acquaintance, so I let him alone. You might treat him civilly at least. You gave him a cool nod, and just now you bowed and smiled in the politest way to Tommy Chamberlain, whose father keeps a grocery store. If you had just reversed the nod and the bow, it would have been right, said Amy reprovingly. No, it wouldn't, returned perverse Jo. I neither like, respect, nor admire Tudor, though his grandfather's uncle's nephew's niece was third cousin to a lord. Tommy is poor and bashful and good and very clever. I think well of him and like to show that I do, for he is a gentleman in spite of the brown paper parcels. It's no use trying to argue with you, began Amy. Not the least. Static. I don't know why it does this in the mornings and not the... I wonder if it's the YouTube stream doing it. Because I don't have this issue. Even when I stream like live on TikTok, it doesn't make the staticky thing. So I don't know what it is. It's only in the morning, so it's so weird. Not the least, my dear, interrupted Jo. So let us look amiable and drop a card here, as the kings are evidently out, for which I'm deeply grateful. The family card case having done its duty, The girls walked on, and Joe uttered another Thanksgiving on reaching the fifth house, and being told that the young ladies were engaged. Now let us go home and never mind Aunt March today. We can run down there any time, and it's really a pity to trail through the dust in our best bibs and tuckers when we are tired and cross. Speak for yourself, if you please. Aunt likes to have us pay her the compliment of coming in style and making a formal call. I need to switch that. Now let us go home and never mind Aunt March today. We can run down there any time, and it's really a pity to trail through the dust in our best bibs and tuckers when we are tired and cross. Speak for yourself, if you please. Aunt likes to have us pay her the compliment of coming in style and making a formal call. It's a little thing to do, but it gives her pleasure, and I don't believe it will hurt your things half so much as letting dirty dogs and clumping boys spoil them. Stoop down and let me take the crumbs off of your bonnet. What a good girl you are, Amy, said Jo, with a repentant glance from her own damaged costume to that of her sister, which was fresh and spotless still. I wish it was as easy for me to do little things to please people as it is for you. I think of them, but it takes too much time to do them. So I wait for a chance to confer a great favor, and let the small ones slip, but they tell best in the end, I fancy. Amy smiled and was mollified at once, saying with a maternal air, Women should learn to be agreeable, particularly poor ones, for they have no other way of repaying the kindnesses they receive. If you'd remember that and practice it, you'd be better than... If you'd remember that and practice it, you'd be better liked than I am, because there's more of you. I'm a crotchety old thing and always shall be, but I'm willing to own that you're right. Only it's easier for me to risk my life for a person than to be pleasant to him when I don't feel like it. It's a great misfortune to have such strong likes and dislikes, isn't it? It's a greater not to be able to hide them. I don't mind saying that I don't approve of Tudor any more than you do, but I'm not called upon to tell him so. Neither are you, and there's no use in making yourself disagreeable because he is. Neither are you, and there is no use in making yourself disagreeable because he is. But I think girls ought to show when they disapprove of young men. And how can they do it except by their manners? Preaching does not do any good, as I know to my sorrow since I've had Teddy to manage. But there are many little ways in which I can influence him without a word, and I say we ought to do it to others if we can. Teddy is a remarkable boy, and can't be taken as a sample of other boys, said Amy, in a tone of solemn conviction which would have convulsed the remarkable boy if he had heard it. If we were belles or women of wealth and position, we might do something, perhaps. But for us to frown at one set of young gentlemen because we don't approve of them, and smile upon another set because we do, wouldn't have a particle of effect, and we should only be considered odd and puritanical. So we are to countenance things and people which we detest, merely because we are not belles and millionaires, are we? That's a nice sort of morality. I can't argue about it. I only know that it's the way of the world, and people who set themselves against it only get laughed at for their pains. I don't like reformers, and I hope you will never try to be one. I do like them, and I shall be one if I can. For in spite of the laughing, the world would never get on without them. We can't agree about that, for you belong to the old set and I to the new. You'll get on the best, but I shall have the liveliest time of it. I should rather enjoy the brickbats and hooting. I should rather enjoy the brickbats and hooting, I think. Well, compose yourself now, and don't worry Aunt with your new ideas. I'll try not to. But I'm always possessed to burst out with some particularly blunt speech or revolutionary sentiment before her. It's my doom, and I can't help it. They found Aunt Carol with the old lady, both absorbed in some very interesting subject. But they dropped it as the girls came in, with a conscious look which betrayed that they had been talking about their nieces. Jo was not in a good humor, and the perverse fit returned. But Amy, who had virtuously done her duty, kept her temper, and pleased everybody, was in a most angelic frame of mind. This amiable spirit was felt at once, and both the aunts my deared her affectionately, looking what they afterwards said emphatically, "That child improves every day." "Are you going to help about the fair, dear?" asked Mrs. Carroll as Amy sat down beside her with the confiding air elderly people like so well in the young. "Are you going to, an aunt?" "Yes, Aunt Mrs. Chester." "Yes, Aunt." "Oh, excuse me." "Yes, Aunt. Mrs. Chester asked me if I would, and I offered to tend a table, as I have nothing but my time to give." "I'm not," put in Joe decidedly. "I hate to be patronized, and the Chesters think it's a great favor to allow us to help with their highly connected fair. I wonder you consented, Amy. They only want you to work." "I am willing to work. It's for the freedmen as well as the Chesters, and I think it very kind of them to let me share the labor and the fun. Patronage does not trouble me when it is well meant." "Quite right, observed Aunt March. "Quite right and proper. I like your grateful spirit, my dear. It's a pleasure to help people who appreciate our efforts. Some do not, and that is trying," observed Aunt March, looking over her spectacles at Joe, who sat apart rocking herself with a somewhat morose expression. If Joe had only known what a great happiness was wavering in the balance for one of them, she would have turned dove-like in a minute. But unfortunately, we don't have windows in our breasts and cannot see what goes on in the midst of our friends. Better for us that we cannot as a general thing, but now and then it would be such a comfort, such a saving of time and temper. By her next speech, Jo deprived herself of several years of pleasure, and received a timely lesson in the art of holding her tongue. I don't like favors. They oppress and make me feel like a slave. I'd rather do everything for myself and be perfectly independent. Ahem, coughed Aunt Carroll softly, with a look at Aunt March. "I told you so," said Aunt March, with a decided nod to Aunt Carroll. Mercifully unconscious of what she had done, Jo sat with her nose in the air and a revolutionary aspect which was anything but inviting. "Are you going to—" "Do you speak French, dear?" asked Mrs. Carroll, laying her hand on Amy's. "Pretty well, thanks to Aunt March, who lets Esther talk to me as often as I like," replied Amy with a grateful look, which caused the old lady to smile affably. "How about languages?" asked Mrs. Carroll of Jo. "How are you about languages?" "How are you about languages?" asked Mrs. Carroll of Jo. "Don't know a word. I'm very stupid about studying anything. Can't bear French. It's such a freaking dog." They're just in the backyard. Can't bear. "Can't bear French. It's such a slippery, silly sort of language," was the brusque reply. Another look passed between the ladies, and Aunt March said to Amy, "You are quite strong and well now, dear, I believe. Eyes don't trouble you any more, do they?" "Not at all, thank you, ma'am. I'm very well and mean to do great things next winter so that I may be ready for Rome whenever that joyful time arrives." "Good girl. You deserve to go, and I'm sure you will some day," said Aunt March with an approving pat on the head, as Amy picked up her ball for her. "Cross patch, draw the latch." Oh, Polly. "Cross patch, draw the latch. Sit by the fire and spin," squalled Polly, bending down from his perch on the back of her chair to peep into Joe's face, with such a comical air of impertinent inquiry that it was impossible to help laughing. "Most observant bird," said the old lady. Come and take a walk, my dear, cried Polly, hopping toward the china closet with a look suggestive of lump sugar. Thank you, I will. Come, Amy. And Jo brought the visit to an end, feeling more strongly than ever that calls did have a bad effect upon her constitution. She shook hands in a gentlemanly manner, but Amy kissed both the aunts and the girls departed, leaving behind them the impression of shadow and sunshine, which impression caused Aunt March to say as they vanished, "You'd better do it, Mary. I'll supply the money." And Aunt Carol to reply decidedly, "I certainly will, if her father and mother consent." Thank you for joining Bite at a Time Books today, while we read a bite of one of your favorite classics. Again, my name is Bree Carlile, and I hope you come back tomorrow for the next bite of Little Women. All done. I gotta start working now. Thanks, guys.